Is it working? Yeah. So let me begin by asking you, sir, that this book, many of you may have seen Dr. Tharoor's speech at Oxford Union on British colonialism. And this book is unusual among your other works because it began from a speech. And I was quite intrigued by when I was reading your description of it, when you described with some amusement on how there were a few months between that speech and when you actually posted a link to it, and then what happened. If you could talk to us a little bit about that, about how this went viral and the idea behind which led to the germination of this book.
Sure, Nalan, thank you. And thanks to the Times of India and to Nalan Mehta for inviting me here. And thanks to all of you at IIT Delhi for showing up on a Friday afternoon to hear about something that has nothing to do with engineering, science, technology. I'm really pleased, first of all, to know that there is such an active and flourishing literary club in IIT Delhi is gratifying. Some of you may have been in my audience when I last spoke here, and I made the case for engineers to study the humanities of it as a compulsory subsidiary subject, and I'm just pleased that so many of you, without having that requirement, are here, and that too to look at to listen to a work of history, which I assume is one of the subjects most of you fled from to come to engineering and technology. But anyway, great to be here. On Nalan's question, yeah, actually, the book begins with that sentence. This book somewhat unusually began as a speech. Because what happened was, I had been happy to do this, but it wasn't even the reason I'd gone to the UK. I was invited to speak at the Hay Festival of Literature. And when the Oxford invitation came, it was perfectly timed because it would have been easy to stop there on the way from London to Wales, where the Hay Festival takes place. So I said fine, and in fact I also addressed the Oxford India Society on India. Then I went to the Union and did this debate, which perhaps some of you have seen. And then it was a great success, I had lots of fun, and I went off and I frankly forgot about it. And then several weeks later, the Union sent me a link, posted a link themselves on their YouTube site, and asked me to post it, which I promptly did on my Twitter feed, and I was completely taken aback. And I mean literally completely taken aback by how viral it went. You know, I'm not an excessively modest guy, and I do expect things I post to be seen by a few people. But you know, what would be typical would be if a speech that I made to 100 people got viewed by 1,000 or 2 in the next couple of days. I think that was a good multiplier effect, thanks to social media. But here, it was just shooting up, and I think, you know, it was literally like these movies where you see the dates of a calendar switching fast so that you can see, the audience can understand the years have gone by. It was that kind of thing. Every time I went to the site, the numbers were just freaking out. The feedback was phenomenal. Anyway, to cut a long story short, it got seen multiple millions of times. I think one site has about 3.5 million views, but it's now been replicated on literally hundreds of sites. The universities, schools have often downloaded it and played it. I've been to some of them where they proudly talked about how it sort of was playing in the loop, as it were, during some recreational period. Or Central University in Jammu actually held a day-long seminar on the issues I raised in my speech. So all of this got my publishers quite excited, and they called me, and my publisher, David Damodar, is the former editor and chief of Viking Penguin India, and had been the editor who published the great Indian novel here. And while he'd left Viking Penguin and started his own imprint, Aleph, he remained a close friend, and I was happy to publish with him. And he said, look, you've got to write this book. So I said, come on. Everyone knows this stuff, because frankly, I thought everyone did. And he said, no, everyone doesn't know the stuff, or your speech wouldn't have gone viral, which kind of made sense. So I thought about that, and then I said, all right, not realizing how much I'd bitten off, because, you know, what you know, and especially things you remember from way back in your reading, and you want to put down in a 15-minute speech, is not the same as what you need to do in a solid book, which people can read, refer to, cross-check the facts of, and so on. So I suddenly found myself embarking on the kind of research I hadn't needed to do for anything since my doctorate was completed decades earlier. And that was quite an experience, but it was actually a hugely interesting experience, partly because, and I'm sure all of us like to have our prejudices confirmed. My prejudices were largely confirmed by what I was reading, but equally they were amplified. I found out more about things I thought I knew than I actually knew. And in many cases, of course, I needed to verify facts, figures, and so on. And I wanted to make sure that in this book, because it was going to be a controversial argument, especially in the Western world, that the references should be solid. So I also read up on a lot of contemporary scholarship, journal articles from historical journals and so on. And the internet was a huge blessing because now you can also get documents from the East India Company days onwards, 17th, 18th, 19th century documents on the internet, as long as you have friends with the right academic connections and access to the right academic repositories. Everything is available. And so, with the help of these friends, I was able to go through a lot of material, write the book, and I'm very pleased to say that, that the end product is not a dry history. It is a passionate argument. And it's a kind of argument that I expect that intelligent Indians will want to have in their living rooms. And when the book was launched just a week ago, less than a week ago, in fact exactly a week ago, by the Vice President of India, I then engaged in a dialogue with Karan Thapar, who some of you may know is sort of one of India's few unreconstructed Anglophiles. And it was a very lively debate, which is what I want to have, about what he admits were the bad things and what he claims were the good things about the British Empire. And so this is the kind of argument that I hope the book will provoke in your minds when you read it on your campuses and across the country.
Well, so one of the things you point out in the beginning, in the first few pages, is, and something which you just alluded to yourself, that this is also an argument of Indian nationalism 101, if you like. The kind of argument that early nationalists like R.C. Dutt, Dadabhai Naoroji, Nehru made. And what I found reading the book, of course, is a kind of compendium, or a very nicely gathered together compendium of all these arguments with your own spin added to it. But also in terms of the global debate, it's also an answer to the kind of histories written by people like Neil Ferguson, who are great apologists for empire and the idea of the British Empire as a force for good. Tell us, for this audience, why do you think the British Empire in India was not a force for good, A? And B, why does that still matter? Why does that debate still matter today?
Okay, the first answer is the entire book, so that would take us a very long time. I'll try and give you a summary of it. But the second thing, why it matters at several levels. As Nalin said in his question, in the last few years there have actually been books by people like Neil Ferguson, Lawrence James, many other British writers, which have actually been published, in many cases become bestsellers in Western countries, in Britain and America, which have argued essentially that the British Empire was a force for good. Lawrence James called it the world's most magnificent example of benign altruism. Ferguson talked about the so-called killer apps that empire introduced to poor benighted countries like ours, and other writers have also made this case. And of course, Ferguson further rested it on two fads, if you like, of the first decade of the 21st century. He said the empire laid the foundations for the era of globalization we're living in today, and how India therefore was able, because of its legacy of empire, to benefit from globalization. And then the second argument, which of course I think he very quickly regretted having made, in his book published in 2003, he argued that the British Empire was the role model for the kind of empire he hoped America would establish in the world, starting with the invasion of Iraq. Now, we can put some of those aside, but I thought it was important for us to actually confront these claims because they've essentially gone unchallenged in popular writing. I'm sure there are serious scholars who have engaged them, and serious reviewers and so on. But Ferguson is a respected historian, and he's got a lot of attention and even favourable press. And then people like Lawrence James and so on sell lots of copies and are widely read in their countries. So I thought, let me at least confront right up front these arguments and refute them. So to some degree, there was a corrective purpose involved. Secondly, why now? the corollary of that is, look, we've moved on 70 years since the British have left. We've got our own problems. Many of those have been caused by us. Why are we wasting time blaming the British? Now, this raises the entire question of why study history at all. But quite apart from sort of repeating, perhaps now rather tired cliches like George Santayana's famous statement that those who don't read history, those who don't learn from history are condemned to repeat it. I think we're going to be in danger of repeating the British Empire, but still the fact is that history teaches us many lessons. But equally important, of course, is that this is not just some forgotten thing from the distant past. The truth is that if you look at the British Empire, the 6 million people in India, according to our census, the last census, above the age of 80, actually lived under the British Empire. Were conscious of it. They were 10 years old when the British left. And their family members, their descendants who heard their first-hand stories of the British Raj, make it still a contemporary living experience. On top of that, there is the fact that a lot of the legacies of colonialism can be traced into the important issues of today. The obvious example is partition and the consequences in terms of our relationship with Pakistan, which is a British legacy. But as I discovered in my research, so too are other things. The Hindu-Muslim communal issues that have come up in India are very much a British creation. The extraordinary thing that will surprise many of you is the extent to which even the way in which we understand the caste system today and practice it is a legacy of the British colonial era. So there's a great deal, and I'm happy to go into detail any of it, there's a great deal that makes this relevant.
So, his book is organized into 8 different chapters, and he looks at each of these separately. So I thought it would be useful to go through some of the chapters, some of the big questions you've asked. And one of the big questions you ask is, did Britain give us political unity? And that's one of the great claims of the empire, that India was just a sort of a collection of petty kingdoms and we created India as we know it. What's your answer to that?
So, the fact is that the impulse towards political unity and towards a conception of India as one has existed literally for millennia. You go back to the Vedas, there's a reference to the land between the Himalayas and the sea as one. You go back to the so-called sacred geography, to use the Harvard professor Diana X phrase, the sacred geography of India, of ancient India, and you find a very, very sort of common cultural, spiritual sense of what the common space is. Adi Shankaracharya, the original Shankaracharya from my state of Kerala, travelled as far north as Kashmir to the extreme west and the extreme east of the country to establish his mutts. And this whole sense that this is the space within which our culture, our religion, our land flourishes was there from ancient India. But it's not just a Hindu concept. In fact, Maulana Azad has written about how Muslims going on the Hajj from the subcontinent were always called by the Arabs Hindi. It didn't matter if they were Pathans or Tamils. The fact is they were seen as coming from a common space. So though you can argue that the notion of India was politically incomplete when the British arrived, you can certainly not argue that there was no idea of India as a common cultural and ethnic and geopolitical space. But on top of that, the impulse of political unity itself had predated the British. Look at Chandragupta Maurya, look at Ashoka. Look at their attempts to unify the entire subcontinent, and those of many, many other rulers since. Of course, most were not successful, but the Gupta Empire, Vijayanagar in the south, the Mughals obviously. The Mughals were perhaps the most successful of the lot in terms of how far they could unify the subcontinent. And this meant that the whole notion of this space being one that needed to be acquired, ruled as one with commonalities across the land, that was very, very much there before the British came. In fact, one could argue that the Marathas were actually in the process of doing precisely that. That they had more or less reduced the Mughal emperor to their hostage in Delhi and were ruling a large chunk of the country before, of course, they had their setbacks at Panipat and, of course, the Afghans and then the other problems that were caused by foreign colonial attacks on India on the western coast, which inevitably distracted the Marathas. But you could imagine a scenario where, had no foreign colonizer come in, that the Marathas might have gone ahead and unified much of the country. So political unity was not a British creation per se, and in any case by the 20th century, as modern communications made it more feasible, it would have been much easier for that unity to emerge. So I don't buy the argument of unity, and in any case, the argument of unity is completely undermined by their own deliberate policy of divide and rule, but in the end partition the subcontinent in a way that had never happened before.
So the counterpoint to your argument would be that the British, as C.A. Bailey I think has argued, brought in a liberal order to India. So in a sense, that had an indigenous force united India in the way we know it in a modern sense, would it have been ruled by Manusmriti or something else, that essentially our modern legacies today of the current framework as we know it came from the British. How do you respond to that as a liberal yourself?
Well, first of all, counterfactuals are very difficult to argue because my suppositions are as good as yours or somebody else's, but look at Japan. They also had a very traditional monarchy, and then they had the samurai and the shoguns and a fairly authoritarian system. But eventually it evolved into one that has become now, of course there was finally the interruption of the American occupation for 10 years, but it has become essentially a very, very thriving constitutional monarchy without the benefit, except for those 10 years, of being colonized by anybody else. So the fact is that you could argue that India could have evolved that way. Thailand similarly, far from a perfect democracy, I agree, and with bouts of military rule and so on, but they were also not colonized by anybody. The king has continued, and under the king you've seen a succession of civilian and some military prime ministers who also exercised power and who were, in the 20th century, the result of more or less free elections. Now some say, well yes, but look at Nepal. We might have ended up as a larger Nepal. But that's where the mights become. I would argue that the impulses in India and the existence of enlightened rulers and so on before the British suggest that we need not have evolved in the worst possible way. We could have evolved in like the better examples that are available in the other countries. In any case, as far as the liberal order is concerned, I do debunk that in the book. For example, the liberalism of the British rule of law was in fact far from genuinely liberal. Justice in the British Empire was very much attentive to the skin color of the defendant. So large numbers of Englishmen were not even fined, or at worst they were fined for killing Indians. Whereas any Indian who so much as raised a hand in violence against Englishmen was usually hanged, or at best deported off to the Andamans and in the earlier years to Singapore and so on. So the fact is that standards of justice were in fact in the entire, and I did a bit of research on this, in the entire 200 years of British rule, there were only 4 cases involving Englishmen killing Indians in which the Englishmen were convicted, and none of them was hanged.
There's a lovely quote in your book from Narayan Singh, who's an official of the Mughal Empire, of the later Mughals, who says, "What honor is left when we have to take orders from a handful of traders who've not yet learned how to wash their bottoms?" Now these traders, and you point out very aptly that this was an early case of a multinational really taking over control of a country. But I was struck by one of the arguments you make as an aside almost in your chapter on democracy and rule of law, where you argue that the British parliamentary system that we adopted and our constitution makers adopted essentially the same model which was the model of Westminster, that you personally think that that's not the best model for India. I think you say in the book that you personally do not agree, or you personally do not think that the Westminster model of democracy is the best model for us to have adopted. We could have adopted a different model. If you can elucidate your thoughts on that.
Yeah, the Westminster model is a rather bizarre model objectively because, first of all, it involves the perversion of electing a legislature in order to form the executive. So you're not actually electing a legislature for the principal purpose of legislating. Why do people run for parliament or for a state assembly? It's in the hope of forming the government, becoming a minister, exercising power, whatever. And so you get the wrong kind of people by definition, because you're not getting people whose principal interest is in forming laws and policies. You're getting people who are looking for power. which is, to my mind, problematic at the best of times. Secondly, you've got a system in which, in a small island country, in those days of barely 30 million people, where each constituency, and they still had about 650 MPs, so you had each constituency was about 30,000 voters. And in fact, when they started having elections, it was even less, because women couldn't vote till 1922. So the fact is that you're looking at a very, very small electorate, and you're looking at a very small political class. In some cases, you could buy your MPs. Literally, with people like Robert Clive and many of the so-called East India Company nabobs and Nawabs, Angrez who went back with their money, bought what are called rotten boroughs in order to get themselves a seat in Parliament. Now, this kind of system then evolved into the modern British democracy we know, but required very coherent political parties organized on the basis of definable ideologies, class interests, and so on. And as you know, there are real differences between the class composition, political interests, ideologies and policies of the Conservative Party on the one hand and the Labour Party on the other. Now, we don't actually have anything like that in our country. For various reasons, by and large in our country, our parties have all been variants of a certain national consensus going back to the Congress's, shall we say, view of how the economy should be organized, how the country should be run, how foreign policy should be conducted, etc., with very little dissent till now. And at the same time, you have a tendency for people to look up to individual candidates. So even today, in the 21st century, you want Jayalalitha to be Chief Minister of Tamil Nadu, therefore you vote for her party and the symbol of her party. It little matters who the candidate is. If you want Mamata Banerjee to rule Bengal, you'll support her party even if her candidates are largely unknown to you and so on. Which is exactly the opposite of the system that the British intended, where the connection between the local representative and his people was supposed to be what actually gave the country a truly representative democracy. So all of these things didn't work. And then how has the system worked in India? We've seen for 25 years, until Mr. Modi's victory in 2014, parliamentary system has confined us to coalition governance. And believe me, it's very likely it will again happen after 2019. What does coalition governance mean? That because you are dependent upon a parliamentary majority, what happens is that you are coming to power through a majority that has to be sustained, which means you govern on the basis of the lowest common denominator of your coalition. Since any coalition member pulling out might bring your government down, you have no capacity to plan credibly for a long period of time, because your government could fall at any time, and you spend more of your time and energy staying in power rather than in using it for the common man's benefit. Now, these are the kinds of challenges that the working of the parliamentary system in India has demonstrated. On top of that, we've had the whip system, where there's really no freedom of expression for legislators. They have to follow the party line, etc. In many, many ways, I believe, I'm a profoundly convinced Democrat. I believe democracy is indispensable for a diverse society like ours. But the form of democracy we've chosen, I believe, is actually not the right one for us. I think we should have actually gone for a presidential system. Indeed, I have an unlikely support for this view from the last British Prime Minister who ruled over India, Clement Attlee, who said that when he'd come to India with a constitutional commission, he had suggested a presidential system, and he said the Indians rejected it with great emphasis. They reacted as if I had offered them margarine instead of butter. And that was part of the problem. The nationalists of that era had grown up essentially being denied the benefits that the English enjoyed for themselves, and therefore the big ambition was to get for themselves, for our country, what the British had denied to us. And that's why perhaps the tendency to go for the Westminster model, rather than think objectively as to what would work best for India.
One last question before we open it up for questions from the audience. By the way, I'm imagining Rahul Gandhi versus Narendra Modi presidential contest. The question I want to ask you is...
You should let Rahul Gandhi choose the language.
The question I wanted to ask you is that, the argument about British rapacity, the argument about Britain deindustrializing India, as you put it, and industrializing itself, that's sort of beyond doubt. The question I wanted to ask you is, there are someone about the legacies of British rule. English is the linked language in this country still. We are conducting this discussion in English. As someone who is an ardent admirer of cricket, cricket is the sort of center of our nationalism, or among the centers of our nationalism today. As a drinker of tea, and I think you say in the book that it's one of your great passions, tea and cricket. All of these are British legacies. How do we reconcile all of that? I mean, is there nothing that was redeemable in colonialism?
All of these things in every single one of your examples is true, and I've mentioned it in the book, but not one of them was intended by the British to benefit us. Not one of them. You take the English language, as Macaulay made very clear, the idea was to create a thin class of interpreters between the governors and the governed, the rulers and the ruled. It was not intended to spread, quote unquote, the benefits of the English language throughout the Indian population. They had no desire, no ambition, and were not prepared to spend the resources to do that anyway. Similarly, when it comes
to... May I interrupt for a second? Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah.
On this question, I completely buy the argument about Macaulay and all of that, but one of the critics of your intervention in Oxford, which you write about in the book, was later on people came and said, but you know, he's revived the Woodhouse Society, and now he's saying, oh, you know, all of this was about creating a class of class. How do you respond to that criticism?
Well, look, I mean, first of all, I give the Indian nationalists the credit for having seized upon this instrument of colonial rule and turned it to our benefit. That is, having seized upon English and made it into a vehicle for Indian nationalism. The first attacks on colonial injustice, like the books by Dadabhai Naoroji, who wrote a book called Poverty and Un-British Rule in India. The writings of Ramesh Chandra Dutt, the writings of later nationalists, were writings that used English against the English in a very effective way. That's the first thing to understand, that we should give our own forebears credit for having done that. But secondly, the language itself is a neutral tool. How you acquire it is what I'm objecting to. Had we acquired English from sort of very sort of toothsome young VSOs teaching us in British Council classrooms, we might not object to it, but getting it from the boot of a British master sergeant is a different story. In other words, that to acquire it at the price of colonialism is too high a price to pay. Then when you look at the language, you've got it, you can certainly use it. I celebrate Woodhouse because in fact the world he conjures up is as foreign to an Englishman as it's to me. It is really a never idyllic world that he's created, and the delights he uses, the delightful use of the English language by Woodhouse, his similes, his metaphors, his style, his wit, his plotting, etc., can appeal across all political divides. And that, to my mind, in fact, I recount how my former mother-in-law, as a teenager, introduced Lord Mountbatten to the works of P.G. Woodhouse. Because her father, who was a prominent Indian nationalist, actually had read Woodhouse and was a fan of his, and Lord Mountbatten, the last Viceroy of Britain, had never read Woodhouse. So, to my mind, there is no political allegiance involved in enjoying the wit and humour of great writing. Now, similarly with cricket, and of course the British brought in cricket, but they brought it to play amongst themselves. Again, Indians learned the thing in order to have something they could play on equal terms with their masters. And in places like Bengal, there's actually a thesis I have read, a doctoral thesis, that somebody has published as a book about how cricket was an instrument of Bengali nationalism in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, because it was they adopted the sport in reaction to the caricatured portrayal of Bengalis as effeminate by the English, these effeminate bookish bodies. Now we are also manly, we can play cricket, we can beat you at it. And this sort of thing made cricket even an instrument of Indian nationalism. Which is why, when we're playing England as we are these days, it matters a great deal. It matters in a very different way from the way in which we feel when we play Pakistan. And of course, in a qualitatively different way from when we play any other country in the world. It matters that we do not disgrace ourselves, that we perform with pride.
There is, of course, that masterly quote by Ashish Nandi about how cricket is an English game.
No, it's an Indian game,
accidentally invented by the English.
And then the third example was tea. Tea, definitely, the case is very easy. The British were importing tea from China, which of course was expensive and subject to other restraints in China. So they were desperate to grow tea in their own possessions, and India, particularly northeastern India, Assam, seemed to have the right climate. So they actually sent a spy guy with the improbable name of Robert Fortune, sounds like something out of a James Bond type thriller, to China to actually steal plants and smuggle them back to India. But in those days, there was no jet travel, right? You had to bring them by ship and so on, and they all died. Without exception, 3-4 trips, all of them unsuccessful, all the plants died before coming to India. Then, serendipitously, an Englishman discovered something growing wild in Assam that looked like tea. So he put it in boiling water and voila, he had tea. And what is more, a stronger tea than you could get from China, and something that was more palatable to the British housewife. So the British cultivated tea purely in their own interest. They had no desire to sell it to Indians, and you'll be surprised, given how ubiquitous chai is today, that practically very few Indians had access to tea until very late. The Great Depression of the late 20s, early 1930s meant trade went down, the market collapsed in Britain for luxury and dispensable tastes like tea. They suddenly had vast quantities of unsold stock they had to get rid of. Other companies were going broke, so they realized they had to cultivate an Indian market. So it was as recently as just now, 85 years ago, that tea was being sold on a mass scale for Indian consumers, only because of the depression. Of course, thereafter it spread through, and we have made it our own, and indeed nothing quite like Indian masala chai, which the British, of course, had never drunk until we created it. So.